Welcome to the Just Ingredients podcast. I'm Cara Lynn, and here we talk all things nourishing to the mind, body, and soul. This is a place where you can find just good ingredients to life. Welcome back to the show, everyone. We are in for another great episode today. I love hosting fellow health podcasters because of the wealth and knowledge and experience they bring. Today, I have Simon Hill, a physiotherapist and nutrition scientist and host of the Proof podcast, where he features experts who translate research into practical advice. Simon has dedicated his life to simplifying health and nutrition information, and I am so excited for him to share some of his expertise with us today. So welcome to the show, Simon.
Carolyn, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you and all of your community.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. You have been a person that we have wanted on the podcast for so long because I love what you teach on social media, on your podcast, and I love how you challenge some of these researchers and some of the science that's out there. And sometimes I'm like, ooh, that was good what he just said or what he, claimed with the research. So thank you for everything that you're doing. But before we delve into our topic today, will you just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself, your background?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a qualified physiotherapist. That's where I sort of begun my career. I was working with professional footballers in Australia and also had a passion for nutrition. So I followed that up. I went back to university and did a master's in nutrition science. And since then have been involved in publishing research in that space, and there's more to come. My kind of passion and love for science goes back to when I was a kid, as far back as I can recall. My dad's a professor. He's now been a professor of physiology for over 40 years and publishes in Cell and Metabolism and all of the major journals. His research looks, it's basic science, but very much interested in how our arteries work and what happens when we develop cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So I was kind of growing up in an environment, and I'm holding up on the screen, I'm not sure if people are watching on video, where scientific studies were littered all around the house and in the car, and I was often having to shift them just to be able to sit down, and they would be highlighted and scribbled on. And so I realized that science had some type of important role, and it seemed to be important to my dad. And over time, I learned about the scientific method and how we can use the scientific method to better understand the world, to test our hypotheses and intuition. I think you alluded earlier that I challenge things online. A lot of what I challenge is often, I think people have a kind of intuitive thought, which does seem logical, and accept it at face value without actually considering that often our hypotheses are wrong. And in fact, more often than not, they are wrong. And science and the scientific method, which there is an actual method for going about science, allows us to test these things and sort of move closer to some form of truth, really to reduce uncertainty. You're not getting ever to an absolute concrete truth, but you're reducing uncertainty through this method. And so I've kind of fell in love with the idea of using the scientific method to better understand the world at an early age. And that kind of led to what I went on to pursue after I finished my high school.
So interesting. That would be some fascinating dinner conversations, I could imagine, between your family and with your dad.
Yeah, well, a lot of me asking silly questions, which is probably what I'm still doing now as a podcast host. When I get these academics, I tend to get a lot of academics on my show who have been researching a specific area of health for 30 or 40 years, like Walter Willett, for example, from Harvard, who's one of the most published nutrition scientists, I think the most cited nutrition scientist in the world. I'll have someone on like him. It reminds me of me sitting at the dinner table with my dad and asking those silly questions and getting him to explain things in a way that I could understand. And these academics are so full of knowledge, but often their experience is at these conferences. So, for example, right now in LA, my dad's here. He's at this diabetes cardiovascular conference that happens once a year. It's in Los Angeles. And I've been to these conferences, and the language and the communication is very much, it's a different language. So they become accustomed to just talking with academics and not necessarily talking to the general public. So that was very much why I started my show. And when I'm having these conversations, I'm really trying to extract information from these academics, but get it within arm's reach of the general person who can use that information to really improve their life.
Yeah, I was gonna say those studies are very complex, very hard to read and research, and they're very lengthy and long, some of them. And so I do love how you simplify the information and make it applicable to our lives and our health and things like that. So you do a great job with that. So thank you. Today, though, I want to talk about because you have talked about the top 10 biomarkers for our health. And so, what if we just like start at the beginning of what are biomarkers and why are they so important and which ones should we talk about today?
Even if we zoom out a little bit further, uh, many people, certainly myself and a lot of the community that I'm speaking to, they're interested in increasing their health span, which is really about increasing the number of years of life where you're not affected by some type of chronic disease that is significantly affecting your quality of life, your ability to go about your life and do the things that are bringing you fulfillment. So we're talking about optimizing fulfillment at an individual level and among our community, and being free of disease is going to help us achieve that kind of that mission. These diseases occur, sort of bubble away under the skin over 20, 30, 40 years. Something like atherosclerosis, for example, which is the most common cause of cardiovascular disease, where we have this buildup of plaque in the artery. That takes a long, long time to develop. So through science, we've been able to identify things that we can actually measure in real time when you're 30 or you're 40 that will predict your risk of developing atherosclerosis and then going on to have that disease. So what a biomarker is it is something that we can kind of test today that has been validated as a predictor of X disease, whether it's fatty liver disease or type 2 diabetes or dementia or cardiovascular disease. These cardiometabolic diseases and cancer tend to be the kind of top chronic diseases that we're trying to avoid if we want to maximize health span. So biomarkers allow us to, earlier in life, screen our physiology and our function, and then say, hey, how are we tracking here? Are we kind of, do we have a heightened risk of developing one of these diseases in our 50s or 60s? And if so, okay, well, what do we know about that biomarker that we would like to improve in terms of what science-based interventions exist that can push that biomarker into a favorable direction? So when I talk about biomarkers, my philosophy and approach, and these, what I call the 10 truths, which were kind of fundamental to a challenge I put out last year called the Living Proof Challenge. And we can go into the backstory of why I did this later if you want. But when I was establishing these 10 biomarkers, my thought process was this: there are so many things we can measure. And certainly there's more than 10 things that are important. I'm not saying that it's only 10 things, but we can measure, thousands of things. Not all of those things that we measure are validated. So often you can get information and it's not necessarily a reliable marker. It could fluctuate day to day. It might not be very predictive of disease. Secondly, not all of those things that we measure, there is concrete evidence to show how you can improve them. And so often people can be left measuring things and it's like, what can you do with that information? So what I tried to do was distill it down and say, okay, if we're trying to avoid these cardiometabolic diseases, what's a short list of things that speaks to the health of your arteries, which we know is going to be very important, which speaks to the health, your metabolic health, which really comes back to liver function, pancreatic function, and muscle tissue, which speak to musculoskeletal function, We know that being strong and having good bone mineral density is really important as we age for physical function, frailty, for navigating our environment, and speaks to psychological well-being. What's a short list of things that we can measure that speak to all of those systems of the body? Not only are relatively easily measurable, but that we have good concrete evidence that you, the listener, can actually improve them through diet or exercise or some type of intervention. In some cases, it may be medicine, depending on your genetics and where your baseline is. And it was through that philosophy that I was able to kind of distill this down into 10 biomarkers. And I can list them off if you'd like, but they act as windows into those various systems of the body that I just mentioned. And when you optimize them, you are reducing your risk of these diseases and hopefully increasing your health span.
I love that this testing is available and that you're making it aware to people, because I think it is important for people to realize, yeah, these diseases don't happen overnight. They're taking 10, 20, 30 years to develop. That's why taking care of our health now in your 20s and 30s and 40s is so important. It's not just for those in their 80s. And so I love that you're teaching people about this. And so I want to break the biomarkers down into categories, if that's okay. And first talk about just the biomarkers that someone would, go get checked, or at the test that they would do for cardiovascular health. What would those be, or how would they know?
And I think most people here would probably jump straight to like LDL cholesterol, blood lipids. I'm going to save that. I'm going to start with one that I think is very accessible. Most people know about it, but very few people are testing it. And nearly half the population do have suboptimal levels of this biomarker. And that is blood pressure.
Interesting. Tell us why.
The simplest way of thinking about this is when you have higher blood pressure, the blood that is flowing through your blood vessels, particularly in the arteries, is under more force. And there's this kind of higher shear stress happening between the blood and the wall of the artery, making that wall more susceptible to damage. So I spoke earlier about, I said atherosclerosis, this buildup of plaque in the artery wall. Well, when you have an insult that damages that artery wall, it actually makes that artery now more susceptible to the building up of this plaque, which ultimately is cholesterol, and we can go into how that occurs. But people who have high blood pressure are at significantly higher risk of developing atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease, particularly coronary artery disease, and ending up having a heart attack. And there is many people in the population who have untreated high blood pressure, so hypertension. And what I'm talking about here is if you have hypertension, but you treat it through lifestyle and or medicine and get it back down, well, you've now optimized that biomarker. But if you have hypertension and you're not measuring it, or you did measure it and you didn't do anything about it, well, you're going about your day every day. And when you sleep, your arteries are subject to much more stress than we would like them to be, which is going to accumulate over decades.
Well, I know people are going to say, wait, what is the optimal number? Is there a number I should be afraid at?
The literature, suggests that 120 over 80, which many people have heard before, is a pretty good goal. There are some out there who will say, you know what, probably should be 115 over 80 or over 75. And so there's a little bit of debate there. But when you're getting north of 120 over 80, so you're up at 125 or 130 as your sort of diastolic blood pressure, then we're starting to get a little bit worried about that blood pressure increasing your risk of cardiovascular disease. And, I think for about $40, you can order a blood pressure device for home. There's a brand, Omicron, I think it's called. I can share it with you for the show notes. I have no affiliation with them, but they do like a wrist and an upper arm cuff that you can have at home. The instructions are pretty simple to use it. You do it in the morning. You need to make sure you've been sitting down for 5 minutes before you test it. And that could be something that you do regularly. You can do it once a month, as opposed to doing it once a year in your annual kind of meeting with your physician, if that at all.
Right?
If that. So this is a biomarker that is highly predictive of cardiovascular disease. It's very easy to intervene on and improve through a number of different measures depending on the person. And so it's one that I want to draw people's attention to for sure.
Such an easy one that everybody can do. So I love that you shared something that's so easy. What about though, like the VO2 max test? Do you like that one?
I think VO2 Max is another great test for cardiorespiratory health, cardiorespiratory fitness, and slightly different to blood pressure, highly predictive of your risk of developing cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. We know that people who have a high or very high uh, VO2 max compared to those who have a low have about 5 times less risk over a 10-year period of having a cardiovascular event. It really just speaks to, so if someone hasn't heard of VO2 max, it's like the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can use in milliliters per minute per kilogram of body mass. And so the more oxygen that your body can utilize, generally the higher or better your cardiorespiratory fitness is. And this is not just kind of speaking to the health of your heart and arteries, but it also does speak to the health of your lungs, which are important in that, and your skeletal muscle. So when I think of VO2 max, I really am thinking of lung health, heart health, ability of the heart to contract and pump oxygenated blood through the body. I'm thinking about the health of your peripheral arteries that are taking that oxygenated blood to the skeletal muscle, and then the ability for the skeletal muscle to efficiently use that oxygenated blood to help produce energy. And this is something that you can go and measure your VO2 max in a laboratory. And there are people that may want to do that, and there is some barriers to that. You kind of need to go to a clinic. They're usually found in most cities, but they are a little bit costly. To do a VO2 max test could cost anywhere in the ballpark of $150 to $250, depending on where someone lives. So when I was putting this into the 10 truths and going through the literature, the main reason that I actually included it was because we have very good evidence that you can do a sort of so-called field test, a running test. If someone can run or jog, there's a test you can do at home that very much approximates a laboratory VO2 max test.
Huh.
Yeah, so
Yeah, tell us what it is because I'm curious.
I'm not sure if did you ever come across like a kind of beep test or a shuttle test?
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes
Yep.
they do them at school or they do them
Yep.
in the army, and it's like you put 2 cones out, or there's 2 lines. Sometimes they do it on a basketball court and they use a baseline, and those cones are about 20 meters, which is kind of 60 feet apart, and there's an audio. So through a speaker, you'll hear beeps, and what you're doing is you're running between the cones, and you have to get to the next cone before the beep. Right? So you run, and that beep, the time between beeps is progressively getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So as you're doing this kind of shuttle run, you're progressively having to run faster and faster and faster and faster. And along the way, it's saying like level 3, shuttle 4. And then, maybe you get up to like level 8, shuttle 6. Okay. And that's as far as you could go. Well, we know, and I have tables in this challenge, for a female that gets level 8, shuttle 6, that equates to a given VO2 max.
Oh,
And it's
interesting.
within about there's about a 90 to 95% correlation. So it's pretty good for the
Mhm.
purposes of kind of getting a ballpark feel of where you're at. So if a VO2 max laboratory test is not in your area, or simply it's too expensive, then that's something that you can easily kind of do at home, providing you can jog.
Yeah, that's a great option. Thank you so much. Is there anything else for cardiovascular health, or should we move to metabolic health?
There's actually 2 other tests for cardiovascular health. They're both blood tests, and I'll start with the one that is a test you really only need to do one time in your life, and that is LP little a. So LP little a might be a new kind of test for people. Over the last 5 to 10 years, it's become clear that there is this kind of subtype of low density lipoprotein, or LDL, uh, sort of sister particle called LPa. And it's become very clear that this is highly atherogenic, which means it's very good, this particle, at getting into the artery wall, becoming retained, and starting an inflammatory process that leads to that atherosclerosis. And we can measure this directly. And why is it a one-off test? Well, LPa is not really affected by your lifestyle. It's
Hmm.
almost entirely determined by genetics, and about 25% of the population have elevated LPa. Now, you might say, well, hang on. At the beginning, you said you were only measuring things that we can improve. And if you're saying that now, well, you're doing a good job at listening. So why would we include LPa? Two reasons. Number one is if you go and test LPa and it is elevated, and you're in that 25% of the population, that tells you, and it tells me and anyone who's looking after your health, you're high risk of cardiovascular
Mhm.
disease. So your blood pressure, ApoB, which we're about to talk about, VO2 Max, everything else that you can control, you're going to have a little bit extra motivation to make sure those
Yeah.
things are really on point, because you can probably get away with a little less.
Interesting.
That's the first reason. The second is there are very big trials happening right now, looking at certain medications that for someone who has genetically elevated LPa can lower them. We don't know right now whether that means less cardiovascular disease. That's why trials have to occur. So we're not going to have that answer for a long time. Those trials are going to have to go over a number of years. So for now, it's just about measuring it and understanding, are you at higher risk of cardiovascular disease? That's LPa. And it's a once-off test because, again, it's determined by genetics. You don't need to be testing that every year. The next one is ApoB. And people may have heard of this. More and more people are talking about ApoB in recent years as a superior predictor of cardiovascular disease to LDL cholesterol, which almost everyone has heard of at some point. If you go and get a standard blood test, typically it includes total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and HDL cholesterol. I don't want to go too deep into this because I've done 7 hours on ApoB on my show, so it can get incredibly detailed. But what I will say is this: low density lipoproteins, or LDL, right? Essentially, what these lipoproteins are, just to backtrack one second, is they are a way for our body to move or shuttle fats through the blood to get them to cells to use as energy. So glucose can dissolve straight into the blood and just moves by itself. We can't do that with fats. So fats have to hop onto a protein because fats are not water soluble. They have to kind of hop on the back of a protein to get to cells. That's what lipoproteins are. It is a protein that's carrying these fats to cells. So low density lipoprotein is just one of those. Over the last few decades, it's become clear that the protein that's on the lipoproteins is what makes them susceptible to getting lodged and stuck into the artery wall. Low density lipoproteins contain this apolipoprotein B on them. But they're not the only ones. There are other lipoproteins like very low density lipoprotein and intermediate density lipoprotein that also contain apolipoprotein B on them. So when you measure ApoB, you get the summation of all of the ApoB containing lipoproteins, so VLDL, IDL, and LDL in the blood. So you're getting the total concentration of lipoproteins that have the potential to get stuck in the artery wall, which is a slightly superior to just measuring LDL. I just explained a ton of physiology in a short period, so
You did a great
I
job of
understand
simplifying that.
I understand if that is a little crazy. It's kind of meant to be, but all in all, one of the 10 truths is measuring ApoB, and more doctors are now open to measuring this because there's big consensus papers, like one that was just published in by the National Lipid Association, again emphasizing that ApoB is superior to LDL cholesterol, particularly in people who have poor metabolic health, which is a large percentage of the American public and the Australian public, any kind of Western country. So you can go and measure that, and it's really just telling you how many of these particles do you have floating around in circulation that could be crashing into the artery wall and getting stuck. And we know very clearly what levels are bad news, and we know at what level those particles are not crashing into the artery wall and getting stuck. And there's a lot of different types of evidence that we use to determine that through observational, genetic, and randomized controlled trials. So it's another marker you can measure. If it's not optimized, both lifestyle and or medicine, depending on who you are, you can get that to a level that literally where we don't see these lipoproteins crashing into the artery wall and building up. And that's why you'll hear many lipidologists today saying that atherosclerosis, which is the number one cause of death and cardiovascular disease, it doesn't need to exist. Unlike cancer, where there are so many things we don't understand. Cardiovascular disease, sure, there's things that we need to still learn, but we know the very root cause of the disease is elevations in ApoB containing lipoproteins. And if you crush that down, if you get that down to a healthy level early in life, because it's like cigarettes, it's like exposure over lifetime that matters. The earlier in life you get that down, you can really, avoid this as a disease that you have to deal with later in life.
This is so fascinating. And I know my listeners are going to have two questions. One, they're going to say, okay, how do we lower those? And two, if they just go to their general doctor, are the doctors all well versed in this enough now to do these two different tests?
So LPa, I think, generally most doctors are aware of it. Will they order it? I'm not sure. You might have to push them a little bit. And if they sometimes doctors will just say no.
Yeah,
And,
I know that. And then
and
I say, tell them thank you very much for their time and find a new doctor.
exactly, yeah, find another doctor. And these are not. I'm not putting out wacky tests without a lot of evidence that don't tell us much. These are very deeply published biomarkers. Good doctors should be across them if they're staying on top of the lipid research. And so I think if you're seeing a good doctor, they'll measure LPa. They should measure ApoB. I should say that, and again, this could take us down a rabbit hole, but there on a standard lipid panel, there is another kind of test that's often there called non-HDL. Non-HDL. So if your doctor was like, I'm not ordering ApoB, non-HDL is as good as you're going to get in terms of approximating ApoB. It's much better than LDL cholesterol. So if you were looking at a standard lipid panel, non-HDL, just keep in mind, it does very closely approximate ApoB, but not in all contexts. And that's why I prefer ApoB, because it just, no matter what your context is, it's going to be the single best predictor. But if for whatever reason you can't get it, non-HDLs, it's pretty damn good. Now, in
And what
terms
is
of,
that testing? What is that looking at?
okay, so do you remember how I said before there are multiple types of lipoproteins that contain ApoB?
Mm-hmm.
They are VLDL, IDL, and LDL. When you measure non-HDL cholesterol,
Oh,
you're measuring all of the cholesterol that exists in lipoproteins except for HDL. So you're measuring all of the cholesterol in LDL, IDL, and VLDL essentially, right? So you're getting an indirect look into potentially the number of particles, which is what really matters, is the number of particles. And that's why ApoB is such a great marker, because there's only one ApoB, there's only one of these proteins per lipoprotein. So when you measure ApoB, you know exactly the number, the concentration of these particles. Whereas non-HDL is really just telling you about how much cholesterol is within these ApoB containing lipoproteins. But where that can get a little deceiving is, different people can have different size. So you could have a very high non-HDL cholesterol, but you have very large lipoproteins, which means your ApoB is relatively lower than someone
Mm.
who has the same non-HDL cholesterol, but very small particles. Each particle is carrying less cholesterol, therefore they need more particles, right? And that's where you'd have two people with the same non-HDL that have different risk. And the only way that you would know is by measuring ApoB, which is identifying the actual particle count. And it's the particle count that matters when it comes to the atherosclerotic burden. The second part of your question, and I hope, again, I know I'm explaining things that are very detailed in a short space of time. So apologies if it's not.
They can come turn to your podcast and page for more info. You're doing a great job simplifying it for us.
Your other question, I think, is perhaps most important. Is like, what can you do about it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whether you measure non-HDL and it's high, or you measure ApoB and it's high, what can you do about it? Well, what are these things affected by? So, what would cause an elevation in the first place? Let's start there. Typically, from lifestyle, the biggest factor or influencer in terms of your ApoB level is diet. Much more than exercise or sleep. And the other big driver of your level is genetics. So some people from a genetic makeup point of view, have much lower or much higher levels of ApoB. And in fact, that's one of the key pieces of information that's led to us understanding that ApoB is causal in the development of atherosclerosis. You see people who have genetically low ApoB. So from birth, they were blessed with a gene that makes their ApoB under about 50 milligrams per deciliter. These people really do not develop atherosclerosis.
Lucky.
Right. Whereas you see people on the other end of the scale who have ApoB 150, 200, or even higher in some cases, where they have homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. They can have a heart attack if it's untreated in their teenage years or early 20s. So genetics can play a role. And so what I tell people is you get your ApoB measured, and then you can look at your diet and you can make changes, and you can see how flexible is your level. How much is it determined by your diet? So let's say you measure it and it comes back as 120. I think sub 80 is generally where you want to be. And if you're at high risk of cardiovascular disease, the research suggests you want that lower, probably sub 60, sub 50. So if you're measuring in at 120, what are the biggest levers you can pull in terms of your diet? Well, the number one part of our diet that really drives up ApoB is saturated fats.
Oh, interesting.
Right. And so saturated fats, the mechanism here is saturated fats down-regulate the amount of receptors on the liver that clear ApoB-containing lipoproteins from circulation back into the liver. So when I say down-regulate, there's less of these receptors that can suck in ApoB out of circulation. So these ApoB-containing lipoproteins start to build up in circulation. I kind of liken this to a kind of a shipping port. You can imagine cargo ships are coming in. We've all seen them with the big containers on top of them, and they come into the port. So imagine the cargo ships are these lipoproteins, right?
Okay.
The containers on top are cholesterol and triglycerides, and the ship itself is the protein. That's the ApoB.
Perfect.
Right. Now imagine these are cruising on in to the port. Let's say I grew up in Melbourne. Let's say they're coming into Melbourne Port, and its crane drivers are using the cranes to offload the containers. Okay. What happens if those crane drivers, some of them take a longer lunch break, or they go on strike, which often happens? Now you start getting a buildup of these cargo ships waiting to come into the port. So those crane drivers are like these receptors. So when we eat more diets that are richer in saturated fats, it's like more of these crane drivers are having a longer break or they're going on strike. And so the cargo ships are building up in circulation. And when they're building up in circulation, they're more likely to kind of throw down their anchor and get stuck, which is what happens to these particles when there's a higher concentration. More of them are bouncing into the arterial wall and are more likely to get lodged and over time build up and cause a plaque that can obstruct blood flow to an important tissue like the heart and cause some type of cardiac event. Maybe early on it's angina and then later on it's a heart attack. So um, reducing saturated fats in favor of polyunsaturated fats. So polyunsaturated fats actually do the opposite. They upregulate the LDL receptor, the receptor that clears ApoB containing lipoproteins. So they're kind of recruiting more crane drivers to come and clear these, clear the containers off these cargo ships and stop this backlog of particles building up in the blood. And in terms of what that looks like from a diet perspective for people, some of the big swaps are like swapping butter for olive oil, less red meat, more fatty fish, eating more nuts and seeds, those types of dietary swaps. And generally speaking, if you wanted to think of a dietary pattern, like a true Mediterranean diet is quite low in saturated fat and it's very high in unsaturated fats. It's an omnivorous diet, so there's animal foods in there, there's plant foods in there, but that's probably one of the main reasons. There are others that a Mediterranean diet is considered heart healthy.
Let's take a quick break to hear from our show sponsor. Looking to refresh your routine for the new year? Start strong with nourishing, effective products from Just Ingredients. Whether your goal is to boost energy, improve immunity, achieve better sleep, support weight management, or build strength, Just Ingredients has you covered with solution-focused products made to help you thrive. Each product is crafted with nourishing, non-toxic ingredients you can trust, making it easy to prioritize your health and wellness goals for 2025. Feel good about what you're using, inside and out. Ready to make the switch? Visit justingredients.us and discover how healthy living can transform your year. Kick off your healthiest year yet with Just Ingredients, because you deserve better. Now back to the show. Okay, so this is all so interesting, but I have a question for you. We need all fats, though. So you're not saying avoid red meat altogether, correct? Or are you? Because of the saturated fats.
It's difficult for me to say that at a kind of population level, because some of this is going to depend on, for example, you might be able to just remove a little bit of red meat and increase fatty fish consumption, legumes and nuts, and your ApoB gets to the goal that I just mentioned because your genetics allow it. The next person might have to make greater shifts in their diet or even less. So the only way for someone to sort of work out like how much change do they need to make is to measure, make changes. Blood lipids really only take a couple of weeks to 3 weeks to change. So you could make changes and test a month or 2 months later and see how much change has happened. Did you get your ApoB to sort of 80 milligrams per deciliter? No. Can you make more changes? And so at least that's an objective way of going back to it. Your point about do we need fats? The fats that our body must get through our diet are essential fatty acids. So that they're fats that our body can't make. Our body can make saturated fats. They're not considered essential for that reason. There is some discussion right now about a particular fat. We won't go into a long form discussion that may be essential. C15, which is an odd chain fatty acid, and certainly there's possibility that there are going to be essential fats that haven't been discovered to date. But right now, the essential fats are omega-3 fats, alpha linoleic acid, ALA, and which converts into DHA and EPA. That's a great discussion if we ever get there. And linoleic acid, the omega-6 fat. Those are the essential fats that our body cannot produce. And if you don't get them through diet, you'll end up in a deficiency state because of the lack of those fats and the fats that our body can produce from them in tissues.
So fascinating, all of this. So I'm curious, though, to lower Are levels, would you say sugar or like inflammatory oils or let's say carbs, some of the, the white flour, things like that, would those play a part or not necessarily?
They don't really have a huge effect on ApoB, but that's not me advocating for the consumption of all of those things because they affect other markers. So I think we may end up talking about metabolic health markers like, HbA1c and fasting blood glucose and triglycerides. And this is where I start to certainly think about quality of carbohydrates a lot more. But in terms of if your question is like, what part of the diet most affects blood lipids, specifically ApoB, it's the type of fat that's being consumed. And I'm not advocating for a low fat diet. I don't particularly like low fat diets. We need fats. I think the type of fat that we're consuming is important. And as I mentioned, like the Mediterranean diet, that's not a low fat diet. 35% of calories come from fat. It's just not a diet where the majority of those fats are saturated. And again, I'm not saying that saturated fats need to be at 0 grams. That's not going to happen. It's not plausible. Olive oil, 13% of calories is saturated fat. So you're always going to have some saturated fats. It's not that, often in nutrition, people want to kind of position a nutrient or a food as healthy or toxic. And overlooking the dose is really
Right.
critical here. So it's not about saturated fats being toxic. They're you know they're going to be part of a healthy diet. But what we understand is that it does get to a point, typically for most people, above 8 to 10% of calories, where saturated fats are really having a significant impact on blood lipids to a point where we're concerned about the number of those particles that could be crashing into the artery wall and getting retained.
Okay, so good to know. And like you said, yeah, I do want to go to metabolic health, and we might have to go through these a little bit faster because so many people struggle with metabolic health without even knowing that they're struggling with metabolic health. And so let's help out the listeners. What should they go get tested with their doctor?
The best markers that are going to give you a very quick idea as to where your metabolic health is are HbA1c, which is on a standard blood test and gives you a kind of medium to long term understanding of your control of blood glucose. Fasting blood glucose, triglycerides, and your waist circumference to height ratio.
Okay, before I ask you more questions about these tests or before you go delve into them more, let's back up one step and just explain to people what metabolic health contains, what we're talking about.
Okay, so my definition of metabolic health, and you'll see this is a term that's kind of thrown around online, and I'm not sure everyone has thought about defining it, or has their own definition, but mine is two things. One is you are storing fat in the right place. And the second is you are efficient at converting chemical energy from your food, glucose, triglycerides, into mechanical energy to move or to do various physiological processes in the body, which means converting glucose or fats into ATP essentially. So these are the two things that I'm thinking about. What that means, if we boil that down, means that you're not storing fat in your liver and your pancreas and in your muscle tissue. And your muscle tissue, skeletal muscle, is really good at efficiently producing energy. Poor metabolic health is what leads to conditions like prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. These are like the big kind of metabolic diseases. And we understand that what happens in the early parts of these diseases is that you begin to store fat in your liver. That's like the sort of ground zero. Fat starts to build up in the liver. And this is why measuring HbA1c, fasting blood glucose, triglycerides, and waist circumference to height ratio is really critical. So what happens is when your liver is like the master regulator of your metabolism. It is while you're asleep, it's producing glucose so you don't go into a low blood glucose state. as fat is building up in the liver, and let's actually take one step back. One step back. Why would fat end up in the
I
liver?
was just going to ask you that. I was like, you better explain to
Yeah.
them why it ends up there.
Why does fat end up in the liver? And why could this look a little different between two people? Why can you have two people? I always find, Caroline, I find this very interesting. Why can you have two people in front of you who objectively are the same body fatness in terms of being overweight, but one of them develops prediabetes or type 2 diabetes and the other doesn't? Like, what is it that explains that? I think it's fascinating. It's been a question that researchers have had for decades. And we now really understand this thanks to largely to Professor Roy Taylor at the UK and his work. So when we're consuming excessive calories beyond our energy expenditure, the amount of energy that our body is utilizing day to day, we have to do something with that energy, right? It has to go somewhere. It doesn't just evaporate. So we store that energy as fat, and we begin to store that as subcutaneous kind of adipose tissue, which is fat underneath your skin. So everyone can feel that. You can pinch it, right? Each of us have what's called a personal fat threshold, and this is super interesting. And this is largely controlled by genetics, but I think there's emerging research to suggest our lifestyles can affect this too. But we have a different subcutaneous kind of fat storage capability. Some of us can store more fat subcutaneously than the next person for a given body fatness, right? So if you're someone who has a large capability to store subcutaneous fat, you might have a very high BMI, but your body is able to store a lot of that fat subcutaneously, so you're not getting what's called spillover, excessive fat that then that compartment's full, has to go somewhere else, and it starts to fill up in organs, ground zero being the liver. Whereas the next person who has a lower subcutaneous fat capacity, a lower personal fat threshold, for that given body weight, they're already spilling over fat that's starting to fill up their liver, okay? And so that explains why you can have these two different people who are the same total body fatness but have very different metabolic health profiles. In that latter case where they're starting to build up fat in the liver, as fat's building up in the liver, it is creating what's called insulin resistance in the liver. And I'll just keep this brief, but insulin is a hormone, and one of its roles, sort of lesser known roles, I guess, particularly to the general public, is that it acts on the liver. And I mentioned before the liver produces glucose. Well, it's insulin that dials down glucose production from the liver. So if you're building up fat in your liver and it's becoming insulin resistant, essentially it means that insulin is less able to do its job at the liver. It's having a difficulty turning down that glucose production. So two things happen. One is at the very early stage of that, the pancreas, which makes insulin, says, hang on, insulin's not working very well at the liver, pump out more insulin. So at the early stages, the body compensates. You produce way more insulin and you force the liver to turn the glucose down. So you might measure fasting blood glucose and it looks normal. But in that subject, fasting insulin, if you measured fasting insulin, you'd see it's really elevated and you'd be like, hang on, you are at early stages here. You're before pre-diabetes, but this is like right now something's happening at your liver and your pancreas is responding. We need to get that fat out of the liver. What happens is over time, the pancreas can only compensate and produce that excess insulin to keep blood glucose down for a certain period of time. It's like putting your foot on the throttle of a car, right? You're going to run out of gas, and the pancreas eventually it starts to get tired and beaten, and the cells that produce insulin are no longer functioning as well. And by the time that's happened, now you're not producing as much insulin. You're insulin resistant at the liver. You can't turn down blood glucose production at the liver, and you start to see HbA1c fasting glucose start to elevate, and triglycerides at the same time. And so early signs that you're moving towards pre-diabetes, or even in fact the criteria to diagnose pre-diabetes, are based upon HbA1c, um, and fasting blood glucose. And then the more and more you progress and the further those things go out of range, you eventually develop pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes. The great news is that like we know that if you act quickly, and providing you haven't had like type 2 diabetes for over 10 years where it becomes much more difficult, if you act quickly and you can get the fat back out of the liver, you can normalize and return to a state of metabolic health in the majority of cases.
So I have a couple questions about this. So if you have been told by your doctor that you have insulin resistance, then that it tells you, yes, you have too much fat in your liver. Is that correct?
Most likely, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so,
Particularly if that kind of diagnosis of insulin resistance that they've given you is based off a elevated waist to height ratio, is based off elevated triglycerides, HbA1c, and fasting blood glucose. If they've used that information to say, hey, you have insulin resistance, um, then yes, most likely you have buildup of fat in the liver. You can do liver ultrasounds and these types of things, but often that's not completely necessary.
okay, good to know. I heard a researcher say the other day that 80% of people have insulin resistance. So do you agree with that?
I'm not sure on the exact percentage, so it's
But you know
difficult.
it's high.
It's very high, and the vast majority of people, adults in America, do not have good metabolic health. And I think if my memory serves me correctly, and I did an episode with Professor Christos Mantzoros from Harvard, who is just researching type 2 diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is now called metabolic associated fatty liver disease. I think it's about 30 to 40% of adults in America have diagnosed metabolic associated fatty liver disease. So then if you say, well, what percentage have undiagnosed or are on the road? Yeah, we're definitely talking more than 50% of adults, and it wouldn't surprise me if it is up towards 80%. And as I said, it kind of is that ground zero. It's really, um, back to Professor Roy Taylor. People can look up his twin cycle model. You'll see that ground zero is the building up of fat in the liver and that insulin resistance, which then is what ultimately leads to pancreatic failure and type 2 diabetes. So, um, you know, identifying and looking at these biomarkers early, seeing that they're out of range and acting early, is really important.
Well, yeah, diabetes causes so many issues down the road and obviously insulin resistance. So if we've got over half of the adults dealing with this, what's causing this? Is it just purely you think our diet and so much sugar and carbs and not having enough protein and fats with them and not exercising? What do you think?
If I was being a little more nihilistic, um, I look, obesity is the number one driver of this, and then if you click further on that and say, well, what's driving obesity? Um, I think the greatest cause of that is the food environment, the way that we've set up society, the way our grocery stores are set up. If we look at let's do a thought experiment here. Countries that have low incidences of cardiometabolic disease. What's the greatest difference between them and adults in America? Is it willpower, or is it the environment that they live in? And at least my understanding and from research is that it's the environment that they live in. They're not born with greater willpower. It's easier for them to be healthy because their environment is kind of conducive to it. Their culture is conducive to it. We have built an environment and a culture that is very much centered around hyperpalatable energy gents, quote unquote, junk foods. And our population is being indoctrinated from an early age with marketing. of junk foods to vulnerable populations like children, with the use of cartoon characters and kind of exploiting biology, because our biology at the end of the day, from a survival point of view, it makes sense. Like, we're geared to seek out hyperpalatable foods that helped our ancestors survive so that they could feast ahead of periods of famine. So, the fact that we feel really good and get an instantaneous kind of reward from eating hyperpalatable foods is completely explainable by physiology. And that physiology is being exploited by our food environment. So, uh, we're asking a lot of people to have willpower within that environment, firstly. And look, it's not like it's impossible to be a healthy body weight in this environment. Obviously, you see cases of that, but it's very quickly becoming more of the exception than the rule. Um, so, firstly, I think that big changes have to ultimately happen to the food environment, and then and not just the food environment. It's also addressing many other factors like socioeconomic disparity, food accessibility, things of that nature. Um, until then, what we're left with is having science that tells us how we can be healthy, despite living in an environment that's trying to make us unhealthy. And when I say trying, I'm not saying that all of this is set up, people sitting around a board meeting and saying, "Hey, let's give everyone chronic disease." Our environment that we're in right now, history tells us often decisions are made that um, appear to be beneficial, but they have unintended consequences. And so processing a food, well, it increased shelf life. It fed more mouths. It made our supply chain of food more secure. It reduced food insecurity, so less people were starving. These are all great things. But an unintended consequence was, hang on, when you now take ultra processing and you get food scientists involved and you study brains with brain MRIs and you start to formulate foods that are hyperpalatable, so irresistible that people can't stop eating them, and they're consuming excessive calories. You know, we're going to have some consequences that we're going to deal with later. Um, so short of a very quick change to the food environment, the only real way around that is to have greater intentionality. And I I kind of have been thinking about this over the years to draw an analogy. People in environments like I mentioned before, where they're conducive to good health, they're very much living in like a labyrinth. A labyrinth is designed. It's a mindfulness type of exercise. You don't have to think your way out of a labyrinth. There's only one way to walk. You walk in, you're going to get out the other end. You don't have to think about it. Whereas our environment is like a maze. It requires a lot of thought to get your way through that to get out, to achieve health. And so you need information like what you're sharing, and the stuff I'm sharing in the challenge is very much just so that, like, as that person's walking through the maze, they're getting a few little whispers saying, turn right here, turn left there, do this. And then hopefully, despite being in that maze, being in that environment, they can be healthy.
Yeah, and that maze can be really overwhelming for people because you'll hear someone say, "Oh no, eat a ton of red meat," and someone say, "No, don't eat very much red meat." And others saying, so it comes down to just being educated and learning the science behind it. So I appreciate that you're taking the complex science and trying to simplify it so that we all can understand it. Those that don't have time to go study that for hours and hours. Um, Tell people though, because we didn't even get to the other parts of the oh, edit that, well, we didn't even get to the musculoskeletal system. Can you tell really quickly what your favorite tests are for that before we wrap up?
Yeah, so I included two tests for that give you an indication as to where your musculoskeletal health is. The first is a bone mineral density scan, or a DEXA scan, and I can tell you we had thousands of people go through the challenge last year. I should add it's zero cost. It doesn't cost anything for people to go through this challenge. And the number of people, particularly postmenopausal women, who for the very first time found out they had osteopenia or osteoporosis was striking. And, that awareness is the first piece of information that often, sort of propels people into making lifestyle changes. So there were a number of people who were really grateful for knowing they had the osteoporosis or osteopenia. It gave them kind of motivation to act on it, knowing that they're at higher risk of having a fracture. So bone mineral density, you can do a DEXA scan. They're about $100, $150. It will essentially tell you whether your bone mineral density is increasing your risk of having a fracture or not for your age. And then grip strength. So a very good global kind of strength test is looking at grip strength. And you can use a handheld dynamometer. They're about $20 on Amazon. So this is kind of like the at-home blood pressure test. And it might seem a little funny. People might think it's over the top, but for $20, it's going to tell you, and we have tables where you land, where your strength is for your age. And believe it or not, grip strength is highly predictive of mortality, premature death. So you can do that, and if you see that your grip strength is really low for your age, then one of the things that we're trying to educate on with this challenge is that you measure these 10 truths, but where Caroline, where you focus, or where I focus, or the next person focuses in terms of the interventions, might be a little different. So maybe for me, my grip strength is low and I have low bone mineral density. Well, I'm going to focus more on the exercise component of the challenge. Or someone going back to metabolic health, maybe their HbA1c and fasting blood glucose was out of range. They're going to focus more on the type of dietary changes they can make to help get that fat out of their liver, and some of the exercise they can do. Or if someone's ApoB was elevated or blood pressure, their interventions they'll focus on will be a little bit different. So, grip strength and bone mineral density, they're the two tests for musculoskeletal health.
Well, I love that it's very individualized. And this is interesting to me because a lot of these tests, most of them I've done. But the one I haven't done is grip strength, because that's not something really you go get tested at a clinic, or at the doctor's. So I'm curious, that one I'm going to do. So if it's low, it's just telling you that what's wrong.
Well, it's generally telling you that your overall body strength is probably is lower
Oh, I see
than
what
where
you're
it should
saying.
be for your age. So what you're going to do with that, it's not that necessarily that grip strength is the be all and end all, right? But it is telling it's associated with lower body strength, upper body strength. And so if I've got you in front of me and I'm saying, hey, what is it that you want to do in life? And you're talking about the activities you'd like to do in your 70s and 80s. Well, I would say back to you, well, do you know how important it is to have good lower limb strength to be able to do all of those? And you would say, oh, okay. And I'd say, well, now that we know your grip strength's low, let's look at your lower limb strength and devise a plan to start to increase that for you so that you can be less frail and more easily able to navigate your environment, lower risk of having a fall and fracture, which really does set people back, particularly in
Yeah.
their 70s and 80s.
Okay, that makes sense. I missed that little piece. Well, this is fascinating. This challenge is fascinating. You have put a lot of time and effort into this. So if people are listening and they want to do this, how do they find it?
You just go to theproof.com/living proof, and you can download the PDF there. This year, we've set it up so that you can choose your own pacing. So last year, it was a 12-week challenge. And I chose 12 weeks rather than 30 days because often their New Year challenges are 30 days, which are great. But I thought we have a lot of information in here. I don't want to overwhelm people too much. Sometimes intensity means less consistency. So we chose 12 weeks. Feedback from people Some people loved it. Some people were like, it's still a little too quick. So we've modified it this year. So you can choose 12 weeks, or you can actually do it over 12 months and do it much slower. And depending on your choice, when you register, you'll get coaching emails along the way at the kind of appropriate frequency that will help guide you.
It is fascinating. So, listeners, go check out this challenge. It will be such a huge benefit to your health. And, like he said, to know where you need to spend your efforts, because I feel like everybody in the new year is like, oh, yeah, I'm just going to get healthy. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? And, like you said, does that mean you need to work on your muscle or your heart or your glucose levels? What is it? What is it for you? And so, thank you so much for being here today and talking about this challenge and our biomarkers and how important they are. And so if they want to learn more from you, tell them where to find you.
So you can kind of find me by going to theproof.com, and there's links to my socials. Instagram is at Simon Hill. YouTube, you can just search The Proof with Simon Hill. You can search The Proof on Spotify, Apple, and listen to my podcast. Twitter, or X now, at The Proof as well.
Like I said, thank you so much for all that you're doing, because you are taking such important research and simplifying it better so that we can understand it. So thank you for all that you're doing. I don't know if you know this, but I end my podcast by always asking the guests what they have found to be the best ingredient in life or to life. What would you say it is?
I think it's taking time to quieten down all the noise around you, and to be able to just become really aware of the things that you want in life, and then taking steps to make sure that you're doing or working towards achieving more of those things. And I know some research that really hit me hard was a psychologist interviewed people at the end of their lives and was looking at what drives most regret. And it was inaction. So it wasn't action. Taking action wasn't driving regret. It was not doing things that you wanted to do. And it wasn't inaction towards what they call the ought self, which is the ought self is kind of what you ought to be based on society, maybe what your colleagues or parents or society think you should be, getting a promotion or working harder or whatever. It was inaction towards the ideal self. And the ideal self is who deep down you really want to be, the things you really want to do. So taking inventory on that, it could be as simple as for a long time you've wanted to be able to sing, but you've been too afraid, or you have fear of what other people would think, or play the guitar, or write a children's book, or spending more time with your parents. All of these things, getting clear on the ideal you, what would that person be doing, and just trying to be brave enough to do more of that.
I love that so much. And I love the world is just so noisy. So I love that you first said just quiet it down and find out what you want to do, and then do the things that will make you not regret it later in life.
Mhm.
That is really profound. Thank you, Simon, so much for being here. You are a wealth of knowledge in so many areas. And so thank you for taking the time to be here.
Thank you, Carolyn. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening. Remember to subscribe to the Just Ingredients podcast to learn more about your health and good ingredients to life. Plus, get daily tips at just.ingredients on Instagram.